Hey, so today I wanted to do a blog post a little bit different than is typical. So my name is Emily Palmerton. I also go by Em, and I'm a registered dietitian. I specialize in eating disorders, sport, and the intersection of the two. And today I wanted to talk about how I arrived at intuitive eating and weight inclusive care, because I think it's helpful to know that I had a long period of time and a lot of pondering and thinking and going back and forth that led me to this position. And my current position is more than likely going to change. And it's something that I am continuously challenging and trying to grow. So I thought it was cool. I just got my intuitive eating certification this past week, which is something I've been wanting to do for a long time and finally did it. So I'm excited. So I think it's helpful to just start with a little bit of my background and what I'll say my lived experience has been prior to making the decision to become a dietitian. So again, for some background, I grew up in a very weight-centric household. Both of my parents were always dieting. My mom was enrolled in Weight Watchers multiple times. We grew up with the Weight Watchers prepackaged snacks. And for a period of time, pretty much everyone in my household was, I guess, forced maybe to follow South Beach diet. My dad decided that that was what he wanted to practice and do. So all of our family meals revolved around the South Beach diet's protocol and phases, which is just a very low carbohydrate diet that slowly introduces carbohydrates. And I witnessed my parents lose and regain the same weight multiple times. And I noticed that, of course, in other places too. And the narrative that I noticed and internalized to some degree was that if you lost weight and regained it, then you had failed because you were unable to maintain the degree of willpower and discipline required to keep it off and maintain that body weight. Now, I historically, just a little bit of bringing my own body into the story, historically, I am somebody who has always been above the 99th percentile on both height and weight charts growing up. It's not a good or a bad thing, it just is. I'm, as an adult, 5'10". I won't disclose my weight on here because it's not important, but I distinctly remember in around 4th or 5th grade, the doctor, the pediatrician, making comments about my weight and how it had increased and that she was concerned about my weight and asked me if I was interested in doing some things to change it. At that time, of course, I had also been at the receiving end of some weight-based bullying, and that just, came from school. Not going to get into it, but of course, when my doctor said that, I was like, oh, thank you. I would love nothing more than to end the bullying and to feel okay in my body. So I agreed to start the diet that my pediatrician prescribed at, 11, 12. I now know that my body was preparing for puberty and was preparing for my first menstrual cycle. So it was a very normal thing for that growth acceleration to happen. Thankfully, I was not able to stick with that diet for very long because it could have really impacted my growth. Now, as I got older, I became a little bit more interested in working out. Primarily, I was interested in working out because of some friends that I had at the time who were interested in using it to kind of control their weight and, quote, look better. So I was very in and out of the gym. I didn't ever really like it. It definitely felt a little bit like punishment or for calorie burning. And it wasn't until I was actually in college that I started to enjoy working out. And I'm going to back up just a little bit because part of my story is that through high school, I had started to play rugby. And even though I had that sort of growth acceleration in high school, as I started to play rugby, my weight kind of leveled off and, I increased my height. So I did, appear a little bit thinner. And I became the recipient of a lot of body-based praise. So I heard a lot of, hey, you look really good, you look real, well, they didn't say snatched back then, but it would have been the equivalent of saying, oh, you look really snatched, you look so good. People made comments about the fact that I had lost weight. And then I had started playing rugby. Well, that was kind of part of it. That sort of leaning out, I became a little bit more aligned with the athlete identity as I played rugby, got better at it. Whereas previously I was kind of like last kid picked in gym class. So it was very exciting for me. And especially rugby is an environment that does typically celebrate some degree of body diversity. So it was exciting that I was this tall, strong person. And then when I got into college, I actually finally entered the gym again because of having gained a little bit of weight returning to college. Or starting college, I had gained a little bit of weight. So a friend of mine said that she wanted to start working out, invited me to this boxing gym. And I actually ended up really loving it and started doing these classes regularly. But also, that was sort of the beginning of a really unhealthy relationship with exercise, which again, I won't really get into it. But just so you are kind of aware of that backstory, I had, again, those parents who were dieting. I had a really intense fear of returning to that body that I had before. And I had kind of this fear instilled in me from my parents that would be my future of being in a bigger body if I didn't do something about it now. If I didn't respond and react and control my eating, then I was destined to live in this bigger body, and that was something that was worth fearing. So I started to go to the gym, and then I started to get more into nutrition. At this point, I was a exercise science major, so I was really interested in that. Again, I think I had a lot of these really internalized beliefs that weight is something that you have direct control over, you should do something about it. Being, quote, overweight was really bad for your health, and that it was really something that was well within someone's willpower. Now, throughout my experience in college, I had varying degrees of, again, that disordered relationship with movement and some degree of really, really rigid eating, including tracking calories, monitoring calories, setting limits with those. And what I had started to get into was this pattern of either I was doing these macros, doing this macro thing, following this really strict diet, or I was eating anything that was in front of me. And I now know that those two things were very related and interconnected. They were not two separate things. But at the time, I wanted nothing more than to just be able to maintain that level of control and restriction and monitoring of what I was eating. And felt that anytime I had sort of fallen off, my weight would be out of control. It would just continue to climb upwards, and that I just needed to get back on that next diet. Now, sometime around here, I started reading some content on blogs that were focused a little bit more on moderation and maintenance, but they were still geared from a fat loss sort of lens. So it was essentially, incorporating mindfulness and preemptively including foods that you enjoy so that you're able to sustain a degree of fat loss. And that's kind of where I ended up moving towards was, okay, we could be a little bit more flexible, but maybe, dieting should be something that is happening for a discrete period of time and then followed with these periods of maintenance. And that was sort of where I had approached it. I had started to challenge some of my thinking about BMI and recognizing that it was not a helpful indicator of health. And I had actually had some degree of awareness that it was inappropriate for a provider to put me on a diet at that period of time, when I was very young. So I had been kind of aware that there was some disordered eating in my history, but I thought that, as long as I did it right and I had the right mindset, I could still manage my eating and manage my weight through things like macros and through exercise and things like that. I still was pretty fearful of weight gain and was really uncomfortable with the idea of my body changing, but I did think that this work was important and I wanted to learn more about it. And I had started to think about going to school to become a dietitian. Now, I hadn't heard of Maybe I had heard of intuitive eating. I think I read Laura Thomas's book, Just Eat It. I think there was a podcast I was listening to where she was interviewed and I was really interested in it. It wasn't necessarily something that I was really ready to do myself, but it was the first time that I had been exposed to these ideas that, health is so much more complex than just the number on the scale, and that actually health and weight, there may be some relationship, but it's not this one-to-one cause and effect. Weight causes poor health, and by influencing weight, we influence health. So that was the first time that seed had been planted. I was not totally bought into intuitive eating. I think I had felt that it still was some degree of giving up, and that if I didn't have some degree of control, that my eating would just be chaotic, or that I would never go to the gym because I had to really force myself to do it in order for it to be something I was able to do consistently. So I ended up going to school to become a dietitian. And at this point, I will say I was a little bit of a fence sitter, where I had realized that this overfocus on weight was not helpful, was not productive, was not supporting people's health journeys, and actually would lead them to feel, in many cases, to feel judged, and was starting to recognize the very real impact of weight stigma. Even though I still was like, yeah, I guess some people could lose weight and keep it off, but there is also this possibility or this alternative that some people probably shouldn't do that. And I think actually where I'm at now is probably pretty close to that, where I do think maybe there are some people out there that undergo a period of dieting and maintain a lower body mass. Like, that might be possible for a certain, subsect of people. It probably is possible. But I think what we really get into with the nuance with intuitive eating, just in general, is that, weight loss may or may not happen. It's more important that people are able to maintain a weight and maintain behaviors. And when we tend to approach these changes through this lens of directly influencing weight, that's where that sustainable maintenance is really challenging. And not to say that if you were to make some health promoting changes, the ability to maintain those, and maybe if there are weight changes, maintaining that, but I think there is a lot of nuance in what that intention and motivation, the function of that behavior is. So anyway, I'm going through nutrition school. I'm learning more about what it means to be a sports dietitian. I'm, again, sort of thinking about more body justice, still thinking there's some people who might choose to manipulate their weight, and that's fine. And again, I still feel that way. I don't really, it doesn't really affect me if people choose to do that, but I was not fully bought into this weight inclusive care and intuitive eating at this point. I ended up seeing this webinar about eating disorders, and this I felt like was the missing piece when I finally learned more about eating disorders beyond just disordered eating and overexercise. I started to see things through this much bigger lens where diet culture really truly permeates so many aspects of our society, including how we talk about food, how we talk about diets, how we talk about health, how we talk about bodies. And I really started to dig into some of the literature about health, weight, the possibility of maintaining weight loss long term. And it ended up being pretty dismal, but I also really related to it because throughout this whole period, I had undergone these significant weight swings where I would lose a bunch of weight, or it still had this sense of control, even if it wasn't restrictive. And I wouldn't have been able to tell you anything about what hunger and fullness cues felt like, what satisfaction felt like. I wouldn't have been able to leave anything on my plate because if it was written into my macros, whether I wanted it or not, I was eating it. It was on my macros, therefore I earned it. I had the sense of entitlement to it. So at this point, I'm starting to learn more about eating disorders. I think I actually did in my senior year of my dietetics program. This is when I started to really cross over into really owning this intuitive eating and weight inclusive identity and space. I did in 2020. I began my own work with a dietitian, and it partly was because I had not ever worked with a dietitian or anybody on my eating. I started work with a therapist at that time as well, and my commitment was that I wanted to first and foremost nourish my body and be fueling myself well and just be less concerned about what might happen with the scale. That was my only thing. And I wanted to be able to, quote, eat more intuitively, so rely a little bit less on the tracking and things like that. So shout out to my dietitian at that time, was super supportive, really met me where I was at. And eventually, I think that point in time was when I had committed to stop dieting. And so that was in 2020. It's been about 5 years of not dieting. I will say, part of my body story also is that my weight has been pretty much stable within like a 5 to 10 pound range at the max. I couldn't tell you what I weighed in 2020 because I don't know. But for the most part, my weight has been pretty stable. And I've just been mostly focusing on fueling well for my training and taking care of my body. And it's been a journey. So I did not truly get into intuitive eating in earnest until several years later. I didn't really realize that it was a specific thing. So I read the official book, the text on intuitive eating, in 2022. And that was when I started my work. I think I was starting my work in eating disorders a little bit. I really, really wanted to work with eating disorders more, but I hadn't really found the opportunity to do that as a professional dietitian. I had little tiny tidbits of opportunities. I read the intuitive eating book, I went through the workbook, and I think once I did that, it really started to click what exactly intuitive eating truly was, because again, I had felt at a certain point in time that if I wasn't controlling what I was eating, if I wasn't managing what I was eating, then things would just be chaotic. I would never stop eating. My weight would continue to climb up and up and up and up, et cetera, et cetera. But what actually happened, again, my weight has been very stable. And not only that, but I've really unpacked a lot of the ways that I was using food to support my emotions or to deal with boredom. I also started to get a little bit more in touch with some of those body cues. I did a mindful eating training, which I also found was very helpful. Even though mindful eating and intuitive eating are two separate things, specifically mindful eating is more focused on the awareness of thoughts, judgments, but it doesn't specifically reject diet culture. So mindful eating, even though it is presented in a weight neutral way so that it's not promoted by the people who teach it as a way to lose weight, it doesn't explicitly name the role that diet culture plays in influencing our thoughts and feelings and behaviors around food. Whereas intuitive eating specifically names it, and the first principle is to reject diet culture. And now the reason that we reject diet culture is because that internalization, or sort of using diet culture to guide our eating, can be something that really interferes with our experience with food and our bodies. Now, diet culture, first and foremost, is this pervasive belief that weight loss is pretty much always a good thing. I kind of see it personally in my work as this belief that weight loss at all costs is acceptable and is okay, and actually something that we want. So regardless of the risks of something like bariatric surgery or weight loss drugs or fasting or, medically supervised fasting, whatever you want to call it, regardless of those risks, it's an appropriate risk because it's better than the risk of being in a bigger body or having a high BMI. So I have shifted more towards one of informed consent, and that you have the right to make a decision based on your whole health, not just your weight. And some people may still choose those things, but it's really, really challenging when the message coming from all directions is this belief that everyone should be in the normal BMI category, and if they're not there, they should be striving for it. So diet culture also elevates specific ways of eating and specific health values. It equates this way of eating and health status as something equivalent with moral virtue. So you're a good person if you're healthy, you're smarter if you are in a, thinner body, less body fat. And we see it show up all over the place in even sports culture. And, through my profession as fitness instructor, I felt this pressure to maintain a specific body size or a specific attitude or way of eating that demonstrated my discipline and willpower as a fitness instructor. And this is something that is really challenging for me, and part of the reason I have stepped away from fitness instruction is just because of my own need to work through some of those beliefs. I think it can be really challenging because people are so hypercritical of bodies and so closely associate weight and health, or body size and health, and even body size and fitness level. So I just was not really in a place where I would be able to handle any sort of scrutiny to that, and could not be vulnerable to that. So it's part of why I stepped away from it as I was going through this journey. Because, if my weight did change, then I would have been competing with that fear. So thankfully, I feel like I'm in a much better place with that. I feel a lot more, I don't want to say justified, because nobody ever should feel like they have to justify their body, but I feel a lot more just confident in that, in the fact that the body that I'm in is one that's well nourished. It's a body that I take care of, and it's really not my business what weight my body is. It does not give me a lot of information about anything else. So I'm much more solid in that place now. So this idea of rejecting diet culture, because it interferes with this ability to respond to attunement, because we're constantly thinking certain things about food, such as the lower calorie choice is always better, or that we should always be limiting certain things like carbohydrates or fat, or we should always be eating more vegetables. And this shows up in a lot of ways again, and it gets addressed through more principles of intuitive eating, but it's a really important core piece of it, because without that, then you're always kind of floating through and more vulnerable to the effects of diet culture. So all that to say, I think going through the workbooks, reading the book, reading some of the research, having my own lived experience, working with people who had just experienced that weight cycling. And, I know we talk a lot of times in the literature about how dieting, it doesn't work, or it doesn't lead to this sustained weight change. We also don't look at the hidden cost of dieting, which is often the fact that it leads to this belief that, we can't take care of ourselves. We can't control ourselves around food. We shouldn't be trusted around these specific foods. And that's a direct response to dieting. It's not because of our own lack of willpower or control. It's because we've created this environment where these foods are something that we believe that we shouldn't have, and that, we should be always controlling what we're eating, and it just doesn't work in the long term. So I think there's this cost to it, again, going against this idea that folks should be striving for a, quote, healthy weight, and you got to crack a couple eggs to bake a cake. So that's just kind of the cost. If you have to not keep these sorts of foods in your house because of that, then it's all worth it, which I just ethically just don't agree with. I more so now believe that, of course, people have a right to access healthcare, but it's not an obligation to be healthy or to pursue health in order to have a meaningful and rich life. So health might be a pursuit for you, that's totally fine, but it doesn't make you a good person. And I know plenty of people who are not kind people, but are very healthy. And I'm not saying that people don't want to be healthy, but it's not something that we have, again, this level of control over. And I think that's a lot of where things get missed in this nutrition world, is this belief that, just like with weight, if I am just more disciplined and more controlled, then I will have a direct impact and influence on my weight. And yes, maybe to a degree, and same thing can be said for health. There is an impact on nutrition and lifestyle habits on health. I will never deny that. But if we put so much emphasis on this individual health behavior, then we're not also looking at the system as a whole. So looking at the health environment that someone is in, things like their physical environment, such as access to clean air and water, access to healthcare in the first place, which, we're definitely seeing right now in 2025 with, healthcare is extremely expensive. Many people who are not close to a doctor or can't afford a doctor might not go to see a doctor because their healthcare premiums are so high or their copays are so high. We live in a world where, if a diabetic can't afford their insulin, they may feel pressured or have to use expired insulin or try to stretch their insulin, which can be deadly. We can't ignore that. We can't ignore this influence of this bigger system. And even, speaking about diet culture, the effect of weight stigma. So this belief that people in bigger bodies are less than, it shows up in how people are treated, but also systemically, how they may not have access to certain spaces or feel less welcome, or even like going, to a doctor's office and there's not a chair that you can sit in comfortably. Like, what more profound way to send this message that someone is not welcome in a space than to literally not have seating that accommodates them? So I think there's a lot of things that we need to address when we are looking at health in the first place. So again, overemphasis on this decision and willpower and discipline as this primary driver of health, it then becomes, if you get sick, it's because you didn't do enough and that you are to blame. And this is just not true. There's so many things that influence the development of a disease. And absolutely, like, if you want to do things that are health promoting, I prioritize a lot of health promoting behaviors because it's sort of the way that I show care for my body and respect for my body, is by trying to take care of it. But I don't do it with this belief that if I do these things, that I will prevent all illness. I think there has to be a certain degree of acceptance and openness to the belief and to the idea that we don't have control over everything, and we have to let go of some of those outcomes a little bit. And something that is really relevant is that in intuitive eating, that's kind of this approach that when we are so tied to weight as the outcome and we are just grasping at this desire for weight loss, then we lose this opportunity to fall in love with the process and find these things that we enjoy and connect with our values and do them for the sake of doing that. And I say this a lot, where I think that one of the reasons that people sort of fall off once they've achieved their weight loss, in part, is because what they needed to do to lose weight was not sustainable. Partly it's because of metabolic adaptations. Our bodies can resist this low-calorie diet. After a certain period of time, it will adapt to a lower amount of calories. Of course, we have all those health impacts of that. But partly is the fact that once you achieve that weight loss and you've met that goal, there's no reason to keep doing it. It's way less sexy to go to the gym an hour 5 times a week to keep your weight loss off than it is to lose weight in the first place. So intuitive eating is so very rooted in that sort of Buddhist mentality of non-attachment and sort of letting go of that outcome. So that's part of why I've fallen in love with intuitive eating. I think it just opens us up so much more to the possibilities, and opening ourselves up more to the process of change rather than becoming overly attached to the potential outcome of weight loss or weight changes, which prepares us a lot better for life in general. Because one thing that I will always say is that there is this non-negotiable truth about bodies, and that is that bodies change. Bodies change for a variety of reasons, because you age, because sometimes we get sick, sometimes we go through pregnancy and childbirth and raise children, or have accidents and things like that. And our bodies do change, and that is just a reality. Like, your body will change throughout your life. The way that we can continue to show up for our bodies is by doing so regardless of what the number on the scale is, not waiting until we've achieved a certain weight to give ourselves permission to enjoy life and to be present in our own lives. And I think that it's just a very, very powerful toolkit that really serves, and it is flexible. It's not like this dogma. It's meant to be adaptive and adaptable. And also, it's so much more than just eating what you want whenever you want. I think that is the underlying permission piece of this. Like, you have permission because those external rules are not what's driving your eating. But in the absence of those external rules, there still may be other things that influence or guide your eating. It just means that those external rules like diet culture and macros and diets and things like that, those aren't what you're making your eating decisions out of. You're more or less making them from your values and from this place of moving towards rather than trying to move away from or avoid any sort of negative consequence or out of fear. So that's really, really central to intuitive eating. So that's really how I landed at intuitive eating in general. I will say I bring in a lot of other sort of approaches and modalities, but I think that because it's such a flexible model, a lot of things can be incorporated with it. Lots of behavior change models. Lots of times people do take a gentle nutrition, so addressing nutrition-related medical concerns such as diabetes through this intuitive eating lens. At its core, intuitive eating is a self-care framework. So self-care can absolutely involve, managing your diabetes, getting enough sleep, exercising, going to the gym. It's not giving up. It's not caring. It's not just going all out on the candy dish because you're not on a diet. It's so much more than that. So I wanted to just share a little bit of my own story of how I landed on intuitive eating, how I arrived there, especially since I was a fence sitter for such a long time. I'd probably say the process of me getting to an intuitive eating lens and really fully accepting that part was probably a good 2 or 3 years before I got to it. So I always keep that in mind, especially when I'm talking with people who've been in this very diet culture, weight-centric mindset, is just that it just takes a long time to get there. It doesn't have to happen overnight, and that it's really a process of discovery, and that's been a process for me. And sometimes it's just about hearing it multiple times, seeing it as a possible reality, and then over time, maybe you move towards it, maybe not. Maybe you keep doing what you've been doing. But for me, it's been moving towards this place. And I feel like I'm in a place now where, I don't really think about my body. I don't really think about weight. I'm a lot more present in my life because of intuitive eating. And I'm super grateful for what it's done for me. And that's also why I decided to officially become a certified intuitive eating counselor. So I just finished that. So if you're curious to learn more about intuitive eating, there's so many podcasts out there about it. Specifically, the book is wonderful. And I also highly recommend working with an intuitive eating counselor if it's something that you are interested in pursuing for yourself. Thanks, and have a great day.